This is The Change Physician, episode 123.
Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Change Physician podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, with my Amazeballs co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady, and our Amazeballs guest, Dr. Leif Dahleen. You may not know him just by his face, but Dr. Dahleen is the physician on fire with a very widely popular physician website where many of us have gone and read his musings and seen his journey and followed with him peripherally over the years. So it's very exciting to have you come on and give us a little update of what your recent adventures have been like, as well as to give the listeners a little bit of background about what your journey was with both medicine and how you kind of moved into this early retirement lifestyle. So Leif, great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that Amazeballs introduction.
That's my favorite new word. I love Amazeballs.
Had that as part of intro before. So happy to be here and joining both you and Dr. Cady today.
Thank you. So can you tell us a little bit of background? I mean, a lot of people are going to know who you are in the physician community, but for those who aren't, can you give a little bit about your medical background, your practice experiences, and then kind of transition to where you are now?
Sure. I'll try to be relatively brief, but I grew up in Minnesota, went to undergrad and medical school at the University of Minnesota, and matched into a residency program at the University of Florida. I was a Gator sedator, as they say, for a few years. And then when I graduated, I wasn't quite sure what kind of practice I wanted. And my fiance, now wife, was going to be matching into an internship for dietetics, and that would happen a year after I graduated. And so I didn't want to take a permanent job because, well, my wife might have to go across country for her internship a year later. So I worked locums exclusively for my first 2 years out of training, and then settled into a permanent job. Just about everywhere I worked as a locum, which I think it was 5 different states in those first 2 years. They were looking for someone long-term and offered me a job. And I worked one place close to my wife's family in northern Michigan, and we decided to go ahead and take them up on that offer for a permanent job. I did air quotes if you're listening, without the video. But that permanent job lasted 3.5 to 4 years. The hospital ended up filing for bankruptcy and closed down for a while. I was gone before the very last day, but it didn't work out so well. So, my career didn't go quite as planned, but I decided to take a job a little further west in South Dakota, worked there a couple years, and my wife wanted to be closer to family. So we moved to Minnesota, which is where I'm from. And that was my final of 3 long-term jobs, permanent jobs, so to speak. But altogether, the career lasted about 13 years. And somewhere during that last job, even though it was my favorite and best job, I would say easily, I decided that I was going to be ready to hang it up, sometime in my 40s. And it ended up, I was 43, and this was now 2 years ago that I walked out of the call room in the OR for the last time.
So to kind of clarify that a little bit, what was your financial sort of knowledge before you went into medicine, and then when you were into internship? Because there's sort of, it's always kind of interesting to me to hear where people kind of hear like, oh, you don't have to work 50 years or you don't have to do this. That idea has to come from somewhere, as well as there has to be that degree of financial knowledge. And some people learned it in their families. A lot of people did not learn it in their families, since it's not, oddly enough, not taught in schools, it seems. So where did you start learning about the finances? And then where did that picture of, hey, I can actually do this, maybe I'm going to retire in my 40s as compared to 65?
Yeah, that's a great question. Early on, I think my parents did a good job of teaching me to be relatively frugal. My dad was a dentist, and so was his dad. So they made pretty good money. And but they didn't spend like you might expect a dentist to spend. And part of that, I think, is growing up in a small town in the Midwest, where maybe flashy lifestyles are frowned upon, if anything, not really, looked up to. And then, I didn't learn a lot about investing, but when I was a medical student, I talked to my dad about, I'm going to be making some money someday. And, I'm thinking about different ways I could invest. And he gave me a book called The Only Investment Guide You'll Ever Need by Andrew Tobias. And it was just a kind of a basic primer. These are different investments that are available. And he also preached relative frugality, and reading that kind of set me on the path towards not doing anything too dumb with my money. I think he probably talked about not doing life insurance, just buying mutual funds. So, I started out my career having some basic knowledge from that one book. And it wasn't until about halfway through that 13-year career that I realized that we'd been saving, pretty well, just buying mutual funds like the book said to do. And I realized we were approaching that 7-figure mark. And that's when I really started kind of digging into our finances and figuring out what I had and which account, and if that asset allocation made sense, which in some ways it did. In a lot of ways it didn't. It was a little bit random. I had some target date funds. I had some kind of actively managed funds of funds that looked like they gave a lot of diversity, but I could have done better with a lot lower fees, having just bought like a total stock market index fund. But I figured out, like, okay, I started reading Bogleheads. I discovered the White Coat Investor, this guy called Mr. Money Mustache, who talked more about the financial independence and retire early side of things, and kind of put it all together. This was now approaching maybe 10 years ago. But it was 5 or 6 years ago that I realized what it took to actually be financially independent, which means having at least 25 times what you spend in a typical year, or what you anticipate spending in retirement, saved up and invested, or cash flow that meets or exceeds your typical spending, or some combination thereof. And once I realized I had that, I was kind of blown away. I was in my late 30s. I was about 39, just 9 to 10 years out of residency. And I had no real ambition or intention of trying to retire early. I did think at one point, well, I'll be an empty nester. We have 2 kids, 2 boys now, 10 and 12 years old. And I thought, well, maybe when they're out of the house, I'll be in my early to mid 50s. Maybe we'll do locums again, maybe wind down my career the way I started. But I never really envisioned retiring in my 40s until I realized it was totally possible, and that we would be in really good financial shape to do so, living the lifestyle that we were already living.
Wow.
And so that you got interested, and then you started your blog about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, is when Physician on Fire came out.
Exactly.
And then, because it's interesting, if you look at your old blog posts, you're talking about, I'm thinking about doing this, and I'm when did you finally decide, like, the decision? Because there's some angst in there, and you kind of mentioned here, where you're like, you realize, hey, I could do it, but then to actually take that step, I think it's scarier than a lot of people would anticipate if they're not close to that step yet.
Yes, the blog really helped me kind of work through the psychological side of that. And just, when you write tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of words about early retirement and investing and all of these things, and then it really kind of solidifies, okay, what do I want the rest of life to look like? Would this be a viable option for me? But even before starting the website, I certainly talked a lot with my wife about what we wanted our lives to look like, and how it would be different if I didn't have a job. She had stayed home to raise our children. And so we knew if I wasn't working or tied down to a particular hospital or a call schedule, that we would have the freedom to, say, travel for months at a time, which is something we started doing, early on, and we haven't been able to do now, like we wanted. But we roll with the punches. We're able to be flexible like that. But yeah, it was, I would say, a decision between the 2 of us, and the timing. Part of it was financial. I wanted a really good cushion. I wasn't satisfied with getting that 25 times spending and saying, okay, I'm done. Right. So I ended up working another 4 to 5 years after we figured out we could probably afford to retire. And the timing was based more than anything on the age of our kids and where they were in schooling. And we figured, well, if we leave after they've had a few years of public school education and travel for a few years, maybe 3 or 4 years, then we could be back settled down somewhere when my older son is of high school age, and then he would have the option to have a more traditional high school experience, which I think he would probably want, and I would want for him. So that was kind of the impetus. Once they were, I guess they would have been 8 and 10 years old, that's when I pulled the trigger.
You know, I was noticed, I love how you on your blog, it just talks about how your whole purpose, just enlighten, educate, and entertain. And, you know, just the fact that you got a book from, you know, to be educated by your own father with that book. I mean, most people don't even get that kind of guidance.
Yeah.
For those that haven't gone to your website and haven't really seen all the resources now at this point in your life, what's some of the educational, other than going to your website and following you and getting your blogs and newsletters, what would be your suggestion for, like, if you have children or for yourself as an adult that never got the education, what are your kind of go-to, or at least a broad understanding of all the ways that you can invest and be wise with your money?
Sure. I think, number one is just minding the gap between what you earn and what you spend. And the larger that is, the more money you'll have to invest and the more rapidly you'll approach financial independence. As far as investing specifically, I like to keep things pretty simple. Now that we're, what I would say is beyond financially independent, I've taken a little more risk, made some investments that I wouldn't necessarily make if I didn't feel like I had a surplus, right? But like, to get to financial independence, all I did was invest in the stock market, a little bit in bonds, maybe 10%. And you can do that with as few as 3 funds. And I kind of champion the Bogleheads, and that's a name based on John Bogle, the founder of Vanguard. His followers talk about a 3-fund portfolio: total stock market, which is US domestic stocks, and it holds virtually every publicly traded stock that you can buy. Total international stock, which is another fund that will hold everything outside of the US that's publicly traded, and then a bond fund that holds something like 8,000 different bonds of various duration and public and corporate bonds. And so with those 3 funds, you can have amazing diversification, super low fees, and you're going to get solid market returns. You're just not going to lose much to middle managers and money managers, and everybody wants to take a little cut. And a 1/4% here, 0.5% there, 1% there doesn't sound like much, but when they're taking it out of your return, it really makes a big difference over the long run. And so I like to keep things simple. Like I said, as few as 3 funds can give you a great diversification. And when you try to beat the stock market, most people, even the professionals that are paid a lot to try to do so, usually fail. So I like to be content with market returns, and they certainly were good to me over my investing career when I was working from 2006 when I finished residency to 2019 when I retired from medicine. There was, as you might recall, a pretty substantial downturn in the market of about 50% for US stocks in the bottom out in March of 2009. And that turned out to be a really good thing for me, because I was continuing to invest as prices got lower and lower and lower and bottomed out and then started to rise again. I got in at some very low valuations, and the investments I made in index funds back in early 2009, I think they've gone up 5x or 6x by now, because they had dropped by half. So maybe they're 2 to 3 times what they were in 2007, but maybe 5 or 6 times what they were in 2009. So having a bear market, having a down market is not such a bad thing, especially if you are early in your career and don't have a lot already invested.
Sure. Kevin, did you have another question? Because I have another one if you're not.
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
I can always have a question, but
Okay. Well, I'm just curious because something coming out of being employed last year, I decided to roll mine over into my own self-directed account through an LLC of my own, for my own business purposes. And I'm just curious. So a lot of times you hear of people that are just used to having their employer and they just kind of pick the things they want if they have choices in that. But from a self-directed standpoint, you still feel strongly about stock market investments, or do you feel like investing in real estate and other things is wise too?
So you just did what I just did. I took my Roth IRA actually, and I'm taking a portion of that, and I'll have a self-directed Roth IRA. And by self-directed, some people mistake that to mean that, oh, they make the choices of what mutual funds or stocks to buy. But self-directed is a specific kind of designation that means you can put different alternative investments in them, like real estate, as you mentioned, even cryptocurrency, precious metals, all kinds of things that you wouldn't normally be able to buy in a standard 401k IRA, et cetera. Again, this is something a little more recent, but I have been branching out into some real estate funds and crowd-funded investments. And it adds a layer of diversification. Real estate doesn't necessarily move step in step with the stock market. They can be correlated like they were in the Great Recession, but oftentimes they're not so correlated. And you can benefit from some of the tax benefits of real estate investing. And so I've been slowly ramping up an allocation to real estate, to private real estate. And I'm at about 10% now. And I think I might build that up to 20% as we go on. But I still do have, more than 25x just invested in a kind of a 90-10 stock to bond portfolio.
Interesting. Go ahead, Kevin. I don't want to steal all your thunder there.
No thunder. It was just, I was interested in the, 2008, 2009, because it was a very interesting kind of moment in time. And it's a different mindset when people look at a crash or a significant loss in the market. And I love how you kind of pointed out, though, if you're early in your career, that is actually a very good thing. It's bad for the people who may be starting retirement, but for those of us who went through it and you consistently invested, it's just a huge opportunity. And I had a physician who I had rotated with, actually not rotated with, I had observed him prior to medical school, and I'll never forget, it was 1987. And he said they were watching the crash in 1987, and he was talking to his wife at the time, and they were all excited about it. And that kind of just lodges in your head is, that's a very different perspective to see how you look about this stuff. But I love that. And I love that focus on really just making sure that you are in the market and looking at it a long time rather than a short-term perspective. What do you think from your sort of readership? Because you're focusing very much on physicians, and we know there are people who are not, but physicians as a whole, a lot of us don't have a really good financial aptitude. If what do you think the biggest money mistakes are made for a new attending or someone who's new to the field or just someone who is now making the income of a physician and is now launched into the world with all the wolves that are present there?
Yeah. I think probably the number one thing is that lifestyle inflation or lifestyle explosion, where you have all this delayed gratification, and instead of doing one big thing like a really nice trip or buying a nice car, you get all the nice things, and you might be in a higher cost of living area. So the house is 1.2 million. You might have a practice buy-in of several $100,000. You get a couple of car payments, and suddenly you're like 1.5 million in debt when you add on the student loan debt and everything else. And that is just a huge hole to dig out from, even if interest rates are relatively low on most or all of that debt. That's just not a great place to start. For me, working locums was really nice because all of my expenses were paid for. I mean, the hotel, the rental car, even a per diem for food sometimes. So we had like zero expenses for the most part when I started out. So I was able to save, darn near everything I made. We did take some pretty cool vacations, but other than that, we didn't have the everything lifestyle explosion. And so I think just, the white coat investor, who I'm sure you're familiar with as well, he's famous for telling people to live like a resident for 3 to 5 years. And you lived on now it's 60,000 a year. It was 40,000 when I trained, for a while. And life wasn't so bad. If it was bad, it was probably because you were working 80-hour plus weeks all the time, not because you didn't have, enough money to get by and do some fun things from time to time. And then on the investing side, again, I think not trying to hit home runs. All the headlines are about the people that invested in this SPAC or that cryptocurrency or the latest meme stock, right? GameStop and whatever. And that requires luck and getting in and out at the right time. And it makes for a good story, a good headline, but it's not the common experience. And so, aiming for, singles and doubles consistently, like I said, with index funds is a more sure path to growing wealth. And if you can get 5, 8, 10, 12% a year, and it's actually been better than that for most of my investing lifetime, you're going to do just fine if you're diligent and save. For us, it was about 10 years and we were financially independent. So might be 15, 20, 25, depending on exactly what kind of lifestyle you want to live and where you live is extremely important. And I think a lot of people maybe don't put as much emphasis on that. Now, there are a lot of reasons to choose where you live, but the fact is you can make more money typically in places that are lower cost of living. And so if you don't have a strong need to be, say, on the coast or in some of the major cities in the U.S., you can do pretty darn well for yourself in small to medium-sized cities in places that some people call flyover country, but I call home and always have.
Yeah. Speaking of Austin, Texas, where I live, what you make there versus like in Wisconsin is significantly different.
Yeah, although Texas is pretty darn good. I know the payer mix can be really good, and of course you're not paying any state income tax, and so I know there are definitely places in Texas where you can do quite well too. I'm thinking more of like New York City, Bay Area, San Diego, LA, etc. That's where it's like your mortgage payment can be half of your paycheck. That makes it difficult to get ahead quickly.
Yeah. We have a lot of Californians moving to Austin. Even though it's expensive here versus Dallas or Houston, it's still a lot cheaper than California.
Right. Yeah. And your real estate's probably appreciated a whole lot if you have been there for more than a few years.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Kevin, can I ask a question or you got another one to follow?
You can always ask a question, Melissa.
Well, I was wondering because the thing we've talked about with our listeners sometimes is that when you retire, sometimes you're not prepared on the non-financial side of really having some structure or things you enjoy or hobbies and whatnot. So what is it that you do that you love and are really, there's probably a great amount of gratitude, I assume, spending time with your own family, but what are the things that you fill your time with if you're not doing, medical work?
Yeah. So, it really varies a lot. I mentioned that we wanted to travel and we did spend a couple months in a few different cities in Mexico right after I finished, and then a couple more months in Spain. But by the time we were leaving Madrid, the coronavirus had been there and was, the numbers were going from a few a day to a few dozen a day and maybe 100, and it was time to leave. Mm-hmm. We had big plans to cruise to Shanghai, China last fall and hop around Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, Vietnam, wherever. It was pretty open-ended. Wow. And then cruise back like 5 or 6 months later. So we love to travel. We didn't get to take that trip. Hopefully we'll be able to do something like that in the next 2 years before my older son will be in 9th grade, but we'll see. So we're home, and home has moved. We moved to Northern Michigan, which is where my wife's from, and we've got a lot of family around here. And we bought a little place. We have had a little cabin on a lake for a number of years. And when we moved here, we had these 2 places we kind of went back and forth between. And the ultimate goal is to have a single long-term home on the lake. And they're difficult to come by. As you know, the real estate market has been insane. And we were finally able to get a place this spring. So I sold the other 2 places by owner. So that took some time and effort, although it doesn't take much effort when everybody wants to throw money at you, right? For any house that you would sell. And then moving into a house takes effort. And now we're actually, so what we found was a home across the street from the lake, but it's got 1 acre on the lake, and we will be building there starting next spring, I believe. So planning for that. But our weekends are filled with family time. We're making new friends in town. This weekend we went to a little kind of hidden beach on Lake Huron. It looks like a tropical Caribbean scene, except the palm trees are pine trees, but otherwise you wouldn't know. And the water is a little colder and not nearly as salty, and it's shark free, but it's it's a fun little thing. And the day before that, we took our boat out on the inland lake that we live on and went down to the sandbar and saw some friends down there, and had a beer in the afternoon. I like watching movies. My wife and I just finished Stranger Things season 3. We watched all 3 seasons over the last couple months, but try to limit our screen time and our kids' screen time to not a whole lot. Anyway, I can always find something to do. I've never been bored in my adult life, and I can't imagine that's going to change.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great.
So I got a quick question then. You're 2 years into this. Is there, looking back, would you tell young Leif just before he made that pull, is there anything that you wish you had known then that you know now that would have changed either decision or changed time frame or something?
Well, with the benefit of hindsight, I don't think it would change anything, but COVID certainly altered, these first couple of years. But I don't know that I would have done anything differently. I did, that happened about 6 months into my, retirement from anesthesia. And I contacted my old chief and said, hey, if you need help, I still have all my credentials, my license, I could jump in, if someone is out for COVID or if you're super busy. And it turned out they were super not busy, right? Elective surgeries were on hold and they didn't have much to do, so they didn't need me. Eventually I ended up volunteering with the local health department, and when my wife and I both were at a bunch of their clinics all around like northeastern Michigan. We just did all these free clinics to vaccinate people, starting with the elderly and working on down until everybody had a chance to get a vaccine if they wanted it. And of course, at the end, there were not nearly as many people wanting it as we had vaccine, which is really, really sad to see. But it was very rewarding to be able to step in and vaccinate all these people that were so grateful, especially in those first couple months when it became available to new age groups, every couple of weeks. That was pretty cool. But what would I tell younger Leif? 2 years ago, not much different, nothing would change. I sometimes wonder if I had actually known that financial independence was this thing and that early retirement was an option. I don't know if I would have wanted to know that when I started my career, because that's this thing that's 10, 12 years, 15 years away. And I don't want to be thinking about that when I should be just focusing on, I'm starting a family, I'm getting into my career, and that's where my focus was, not on, I'm at 150,000 now. Just a few more months, we'll hit 200, that's gotta be kind of tough. It's a long slog if you're taking it 1 month, 1 year at a time. I feel pretty fortunate actually to have discovered this whole concept after I had already saved that amount of money.
Yeah.
It's
awesome. Very cool. Okay, I'm just gonna have to ask this question because I cannot find the blog that maybe it's not been written yet, but there was something I read about being that I'm anesthesia. It said there's some drawbacks. You love the job, but there was some drawbacks. I was just curious what that was.
The call schedule. My first job, I was Q3 and I didn't have the next day off. Usually had to work, and so that was brutal. I feel like, I didn't hate the job. I liked most aspects of it, and I wasn't really burnt out. There were things that I found to be tedious, but I know that having read about the causes of physician burnout and having seen others burn out, that a lack of autonomy is a big contributor. And I think by definition, an anesthesiologist just doesn't have that much autonomy, right? You don't choose your patients. You don't choose usually the surgeons you work with. You don't choose your schedule. You don't decide when a woman wants to have her epidural. You are just at everyone's beck and call, the surgeons, the patients, the nurses, and the pager, right? And so you have very little autonomy other than deciding, what type of anesthetic to give and, what sort of induction and how you're going to manage the airway. But in terms of autonomy, that's just not built into our specialty, is it?
No.
Yeah. But I knew that going in. I thought anesthesia was a great choice for me. But I'll be honest, like at 3 or 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, if I heard that the last case of the day was canceled, that didn't hurt my feelings. Typically I was like, oh, so I can go home now instead of in 2 more hours. All right, well, let's do that then. Yeah.
Well, I was just curious because, there's always those things about, you're going to miss some things, but there's some things you definitely won't. So Q3 call sounds like a pretty good reason.
Yeah, but that was just my first job. I was Q5 for my last job, which was 5 to 6 years. And it was home call, although we were typically working, in my situation, it was one anesthesiologist running 3 to 4 rooms in the hospital and doing the epidurals and C-sections and anything else. So you're typically working from 6 a.m. till sometime at night, and maybe often going back in for something at some point. So it was a pretty busy call, even though it was home call.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I only wanted to ask that just because people think about retiring, so want to get away from the burnout situation, and unfortunately, these are just things that people have that they don't like or they like, and it leads them in that direction. But hopefully, from what it sounds like, you just saw that this was an option, and this is something that was reasonable to you, and you still enjoyed what you did. So that I just think
I think that's a fair assessment. Yeah. I liked the people I worked with, and the patients were usually grateful and interesting to get to know beforehand.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, my favorite days were not my work days, and if I had the option of a week off or a busy week at the hospital, I would take the week off, and so made the decision to retire from medicine a little easier.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Go ahead,
So
Kevin.
we're moving closer to the end here. I don't have a whole lot of time, but a kind of a unique perspective from a physician end as well is we're also in the position when we retire is what to do with your medical license. And so I'm kind of curious, what are your decisions around that? And then also for those who may not be physicians, the MOCA, your maintenance of certification, which is a huge issue in the physician space, and certainly in anesthesia, I find that particularly troubling. Just a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm a pain guy, so I didn't do anesthesia for a long time. And
yeah,
the MOCA thing really, if you don't do it, your options are done. So
yeah, I've got a MOCA story. So I was in the cohort. I finished residency in 2006, was board certified in 2007, and at the 7-year mark, the ABA, that's the American Board of Anesthesiology, says, hey, you can now take your 10-year certification or recertification exam, and they kind of encourage it. And they say, all right, if you take it now, you still have a couple times to retake it. If things don't go well and you have a bad day, don't pass it the first time. So, okay, all right, I'll sign up for, as soon as I can. I think I might have taken this, I think it was a summer or a winter option. And like, well, summer, I don't want to be studying. Summer's beautiful up north, but I'll do the winter one. So I took this $2,100 exam, and I spent a good amount of time studying, and a lot of it, and even this is more true for you, Kevin, but I'm in a community hospital. I'm not doing heads, I'm not doing hearts, I'm not in the ICU, and so a good chunk of what I'm studying and the test questions I'm preparing for are not things that I really need to know to do my community hospital based anesthesia job. But okay, I studied all this for boards before. I can do this, and I took the test and I did pretty well. I was very happy with my score and whatnot. And then within weeks of getting the result, the ABA said, oh, by the way, that's not going to count for anything. We're switching to MOCA 2.0. And now you're going to answer 30 questions a year or 30 questions a quarter, 120 a year, and you're going to pay $210 a year, even though you just paid $2,100. Wait a minute, that's a bait and switch. And they obviously knew that they had all of this in place when they encouraged me to take the test and took my money and put me through all that. So okay, if there's any burnout or angst in my past, it's that stupid scenario. But yeah, so what have I done about all of that since I left? This is an interesting time to ask that question because it's been just over 2 years since I last practiced. And so from what I hear, that is the time where it can be difficult to obtain medical malpractice insurance and to be covered. And so I kind of feel like I've met the point of no return, or at least a difficult and arduous return that might require some remedial training and that sort of thing. I did maintain a medical license in the state of Minnesota, which I've renewed annually twice, but it expires in November. I came to the point where my ACLS, PALS, BLS, those would come up for renewal. And I could have either taken a 1-day renewal before it expired, or if I were to decide to go back, take a 2-day, new student course essentially. And I kind of weighed the pros and cons there and decided, well, let's just wait and see. And I can get those back if I need them. But at the times that they were coming up, I felt more and more confident that I was not going to choose to go back. And so I do plan to let that last medical license go inactive this November, at which point it would be that much more difficult to go back. But I don't have any strong desire. I don't feel like I've missed out on my calling by walking away. And I don't feel like financially there would be any reason that I would feel that I would need the work, so to speak. So I'm going to, like I said, be done with that medical license as of November, which will be interesting, but I think I'm okay. I'm at peace with that.
I love that question, just from a sense of identity and what it is that, makes you feel good about who you are. I think there's some people that if they just only had that and they weren't a father and, a spouse and, have all these other things going for them, that might be a harder pill to swallow. And
the more you identify with, your career as, part of your ego and a big part of your identity, the more difficult it will be to walk away. And I've always had friends outside the hospital, and I've never really led with that doctor card. It's kind of one of those things I'll admit, if it gets that far in the conversation, oh yeah, I work at the hospital, so I think in anesthesia too, I feel like maybe the egos aren't as strong as they are in some other specialties, but certainly they can be. I guess I shouldn't paint that with such a broad brush, but in the OR, I feel like we're as much staff as we are. We're obviously professionals, but we definitely are doing the grunt work. We're very well paid, kind of blue collar workers there. Yeah.
So true.
We're lifting patients. Physicians. We're getting blood and spit and everything else on us, and we're
The other side of the dyad that I won't discuss tends to be where the ego is more pervasive.
Could be, and again that varies, but
yes, we don't want to put everyone in one bucket.
No.
Well, Kevin, any final thoughts before we head out?
No, as usual, the interview and the discussion has generated a ton of little thinking points that I'm like, oh, there's something that we need to talk about, and there's something we need to talk about. But I really appreciate you coming on the show today, Leif, and providing your perspectives as a early retiree and having pulled that ripcord and made that transition.
Well, I'm glad you invited me, and I thank you for sharing my story with your audience. And I hope they also found a few pearls to take home and ponder themselves.
Absolutely. Well, things for me to think about as well. And thank you so much for all the great nuggets of information, Leif. And for those of you listening out there, I am Melissa Cady, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. And if you don't know anything about the Change Physician, you can go to thechangephysician.com and join there as a physician or a physician ally, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Stay well, folks.